Hello, this is Adam Carroll of Justice for All, a human rights advocacy organization accredited at the United Nations. Today, we will be discussing building a movement of nonviolent social change. Today's guest, Janiece Vakadasa, is co-founder of Rios de Pie, a nonviolent citizen movement focused on civil rights and environmental rights in Bolivia. She subsequently completed the Nonviolent Movement Leadership for Social Progress program at Harvard Kennedy School after her earlier studies. Janiece has written, as a young activist, I have often heard old politicians tell me that Bolivian society has no memory and that it is naive to ask for coherence or ethics in politics in our country. I refuse to accept this and to lose faith in my own people. I know that my generation has memory and courage. We've shown it in the forests and on the streets, and I see it in our civil society mobilized to defend the environment. Bolivia is both a very specific place with its own culture and history, and also holds lessons for all of us. We will be discussing the role of the livestock sector in the disastrous fires of 2019, the impact of COVID-19 in Bolivia, and the character and unique role of civil society there. How can the theory and practice of Mahatma Gandhi be applied in the struggle to reconstruct democracy in South America or wherever local interests are threatened? What forms of organizing can build and strengthen a popular movement instead of a populist leader? As mentor and movement builder, Janiece Vakadasa is also manager of the Freedom Fellowship at the Human Rights Foundation, a one-year program that awards human rights advocates, social entrepreneurs, and nonprofit leaders from challenging political environments around the world with the opportunity to increase the impact of their work. She is also network manager for the Oslo Freedom Forum. In the second half of this show, we will be discussing this important work to build capacity and solidarity at a global level. So, Janiece, welcome to the show.
Thank you so very much. You surprised me with that introduction, but thank you so much for looking at it.
Sure, and you are connecting with us from Bolivia, is that right?
Yes, I am currently in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. This is where most of the work that Standing Rivers does was born. So I've been here throughout the pandemic, and this is where I'm staying.
Well, we will be speaking about Standing River, even though it seems to be more like a gushing river, a moving, flowing river, because it's so action-oriented. With your advocacy and organizing work in Bolivia, maybe if you could just say a few words about how you first came to the work.
Of course. Well, I believe this comes to no surprise. I am a young woman. I'm only 27, but I think from a very young age, I was very aware of the many obstacles that Bolivians face in terms of access to healthcare, access to a good education, access to jobs, because I was born to very, very young parents. My parents were on their first year of university. They studied medicine. They're both doctors. Unlike many other countries, doctors in Bolivia are not well paid. So from a very young age, I understood by looking at their patients and kind of growing with them how difficult it is for so many sectors of Bolivia to have access to something as basic as healthcare. And many times I joined my parents when they worked on rural areas, my dad worked around the Chiquitano forest areas for a long time. So I grew up among those trees in that forest. It means a lot to me. And I think being aware of all this reality, when I was older, I got scholarships, which allowed me the opportunity to study in a foreign country. And once I realized the huge difference of living standards and access to the most basic things like potable water and healthcare and education, it really, really struck me as something that was way, way more different than I ever thought it could be. And I realized that it was on my duty, and many Bolivians that are young and that are my age and that were fortunate enough to maybe travel to other countries to try and see how we can contribute to change that.
Mm. Well, people who grew up in another country may relate, but we should, for the viewers, maybe take a step back and just talk a little bit about where Bolivia is and a little bit about the history, because many of us are not familiar.
Of course. Well, first of all, Bolivia is in the middle of South America. I've met people who don't even know that Bolivia exists, so I like to make sure that is clear. We are in the middle of the entire continent, so we have Brazil on one side, we have Chile and Peru on the other side, we have Argentina and Paraguay on the other side. And my country is incredibly beautiful. Like Bolivia it's such a beautiful place. We have such diversity, and not just in terms of languages we speak and the ethnicities within our country, but also speaking from an environmental perspective, the biodiversity in Bolivia is amazing. And it's amazing to see too how within that rich history there is a rich history in politics, in self-organizing. A lot of the communities in different parts of Bolivia are alive today because of the efforts made by local people, not because of the governments, be it during the colony times or also during our independence. There's been a lot of centralismo, we call it. So there's a lot of focus on one or two or three cities in the country and not the entirety of it. Rural communities and indigenous groups are often forgotten. So Bolivia went through a very complicated period in our democracy after we finally got rid of the dictatorships in the 80s. There was a big struggle for democracy from local groups. And we entered into this stage that is called by Bolivians democracia pactada. So it's kind of a pacted democracy because although we could vote, it was always the same political elites that would kind of take turns in power. So still, minorities had no access to decide what was happening with their own lives. And then came the government of Evo Morales, which came with a lot of promise. They also arrived to the government with a huge majority of the vote, unlike any government prior to them. But sadly, for many people that hold their hopes in this government, since there was an indigenous face in the front of it, eventually they failed to their own beliefs. And paradoxically enough for us, any leadership from civil society that was strengthening or that was blossoming within civil society that was an indigenous leadership was seen as a threat to the legitimacy of Morales himself. So his government was even more hard on indigenous leaders. And also there were so many other things that were very contradictory about his government, such as the fact that he passed a law that made it legal to do hydrocarbon exploración hidrocarburífera in national protected areas, which was something that had never been legal in Bolivia before. And we had many cases of human rights abuses, like the Tipnis area, which is also a protected area, an area that is the home to many indigenous groups, that was opened for creating a roadway through it, and many other human rights violations that kind of, we saw the peak of it during the fires last year in 2019.
Before we get to the fires, I wanted to ask about the legacy of Simon Bolivar because Bolivia is named after him, and of course he's also a kind of revolutionary, anti-colonial role model throughout the region. And so, for those who are not from the region, I was wondering if you could speak to him and his kind of legacy, or perhaps how people use that legacy.
He's seen as the father of our country in a way, and that is why Bolivia is called Bolivia, because of his name Bolivar comes Bolivia. And his original idea, by the way, and that of many próceres de la patria, many of the warriors that defended our independence, was to actually have a unity of all of Latin America. They wanted to see us as La Gran Colombia, so the big of South America, all the countries united. But then interests at the moment and elites kind of ended up dividing the continent in different countries. There was a lot of time where we thought that Bolivia was going to be united to Peru, Alto Peru and Bajo Peru. But then in the end, elites in Bolivia decided that we wanted to be separate. There are amazing books about this subject. And Bolivar, as well as Antonio José de Sucre, were kind of the ones that led the revolution on this side of the continent. There are also other leaders that were leading the fights for independence more in the Argentinian side and on the Chilean side. But they all kind of united at some certain point. So it's like this high school class, if you want to see it that way, of young people that were very well educated, that had the ideas of the French Revolution as kind of their guidelines, and who also understood the importance of fighting for our own rights, that brought the independence to Bolivia. However, I would like to point out that even though we achieved independence, some disparities within our social groups, such as, for example, indigenous groups and the groups that have been brought to South America as slaves, that was not fixed when our revolution came. I mean, for a year, I believe, if not a little bit more in Bolivia, there was an abolition to slavery, esclavitud, but then the new constitution, because they changed it a lot during our first years, kind of changed that, and then we were back to that system. So I believe up until today, local and indigenous groups that are originary to Bolivia themselves, have not had the freedom that was dreamed of by our founding fathers.
Mm. Well, I hope that some future program will be able to focus on the struggle of indigenous peoples in a number of countries. And I know that at the United Nations, there is a movement to recognize and support that struggle. Now, in Bolivia, there are specific social tensions, and you mentioned some of those, which also brings me to the question: what has there been a role for the United Nations, as we see in some Central American countries where we have the banana republics being installed and supported by the United Fruit Company, something like that? Was there any interference from either, well, any of the Western powers?
Many of the Western powers have had huge interference in our country. And I think when you look at the dictatorships in the 80s, such as Garcia Mesa, Hugo Banzer, when at the time that Chile and Argentina were going through the horrible dictatorships that many people have heard about, and I heard about them a lot when I was lucky enough to study in the US. I believe a lot of people, they don't forget that Bolivia had their own dictatorships that were supported by the US and other countries, but at the same time, I feel like it's somehow minimized because the documentation of what we went through as a country is very minor, and that is a problem we have until today in comparison to what you can see of documentation in terms of what happened in Chile and Argentina. So the interference of foreign countries have been enormous in Bolivia in the past. It continues to be today. I'd like to point out that much of the work that Standing Rivers has to do in terms of environmentalism, protecting our endangered species, protecting our national parks and protected areas, whenever there's a violation, 8 out of 10, if not more times, it has to do in some level with the Chinese government, and also with the Russian government. One campaign that we were getting ready to do last year, but then in the end we had to stop everything we were doing and focus on the fires, was the creation of a nuclear investigation plant in El Alto, in La Paz, that was being done by the Russian state company that studies nuclear power. And the fact that they were creating such a plant in the middle of such a populated city in a country that cannot even control mercury contamination, which is even lower cost to control, was very worrisome for us because of the consequences it was going to have, not just for the population of El Alto, but the environment around that area. Needless to say, La Paz and the entire Andes system, la Cordillera de los Andes, has been heavily affected by global warming. So there are, of course, Bolivia is in the middle of South America. Geopolitically speaking, we are such an important country, and that is why the Che Guevara came here, first of all, when he came to South America. And while the rest of the world usually ignores Bolivia, I think people in power and who have a lot of money know the importance of our country, and they keep investing in us. And it's very frustrating sometimes for environmental activists, for human rights activists, how it's so easy to attack figures, say like Bolsonaro, who is so clearly and openly disregarding of human rights and environmental rights. But countries that don't have such controversial people in power should also get the attention they deserve whenever there's human rights violations, because the human rights community should not criticize human rights violations based on the character of the person in power, but in the badness of the violations themselves. So Bolivia has often suffered of this. We've been a country that's often taken into account only when we play a useful role in a right versus left debate. But in reality, we are a very complex country. Our history is so rich that there is absolutely no way to divide it in a right versus left or one group against another. And I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to point that out.
Yeah, I mean the left here has, I think, been somewhat protective of Evo Morales. He had a very good story, and when he came into power, I think, as you referred to, the 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 expectations that he would change things. But then you mentioned already uh, some of the decisions he made that were very troubling. And I wonder if you could now tell us July 9th, 2019, what happened?
Well, let's go back even before July 9th, because in April, the Bolivian government signed a deal with the Chinese government that indicated that Bolivia was going to begin exporting beef to their country. So
Uh,
I think a lot of people can identify with this. And I would like to point out that in Bolivia, beyond who is in power, there is a huge economical elite that jokingly here we say they're like our Wall Street. And it's the people that have a lot of money thanks to agro-cattle business. There are most of them on the west of the country. A lot of people may have heard of them or not, but they basically control everything. They were in a huge alliance with the Morales government, and they are in an alliance with the current government as well, which is why a lot of legislation regarding forest fires has not changed. And I am happy saying that publicly, but it's not a thing that's very much debated out loud in Bolivia. I'm sure you can understand why, but when that happened, it's funny to see how not that long afterwards, the Morales government released the Supreme Decree 3973, Decreto Supremo 3973, which essentially said it was a Supreme Decree that expanded on previous legislation that already existed, that was already aggressive to our environment. But what this decree said was that it was essentially basing themselves on previous legislature, that it was okay to use controlled fires, if you want to call them that way, in a country that has such weak institution and barely any response to uncontrolled fires, to use fires to expand agro-cattle area, even on forest areas. And that was one of the main factors that contributed to what came not long afterwards. And I think a lot of people can see that on the screen. And this is also the image that they were seeing was already, was not the worst of it, but that was the best one I could find. We had a huge disaster. A lot of people were talking about the fires in Brazil. Our Amazon area was also on fire. And we ended up losing over 4 million hectares of forest. We lost over 2 million animals that perished during the fires. And what happened was essentially fires were started to expand some territory. They got out of control. Our country doesn't have strong enough institutions, and I think people from Africa and Bolivia can relate to this. They cannot control. They don't have enough people there. They don't enforce the law that's already written, and they were just unable to control the fires, and much less to stop them. And that's when a lot of civil society began acting themselves. That's an image of me when I was there. You can see that we were surrounded by firefighters, and I guess you can see that we didn't have much equipment to protect ourselves. And the disaster was horrendous. Like I said, it's been calculated that at least 2 million animals have died. I think it was a lot more than that. I think those are very conservative figures. We even lost firemen because they didn't have the protective equipment that they needed. And during these fires, for example, there was the passing of one of the firefighters that passed away was the younger brother of a member of the movement. So what I want people to understand was the dramatic aspect of these fires, beyond all the horrible things I'm describing, is the fact that they began to happen 2 months before our elections. And up until today, it's still unclear, and I want to make it clear that I'm speaking out of what we suppose happened. But for some reason, the government just refused to admit both the impact of the fires, how big they were, or to send any help. which was the most horrific part of everything. And environmental activists such as myself that were brave enough to ask for help from the international community, since our local governments were not responding and the national government was not responding, were heavily persecuted and attacked on social media, on traditional media, for talking about the fires. So not only did you have an ecological fire, but human and environmental defenders were being attacked left and right by authorities for talking about how bad it was, and they were just denying that it was happening.
I
And
just wondered to clarify. So first, the market was opened up to sell to China, huge market. Then the press conference in July at, was it the Livestock Association, something like that,
yeah,
uh, with Evo Morales being very, very cozy with these people. And the burning was supposed to clear the land for grazing, right? And forget the forests. And then the forest burned and it spread. And then you all were attacked for pointing out the truth that this is such a disastrous policy.
and it wasn't just pointing out the truth that this was a disaster policy. Most of us at the beginning, we weren't even pointing out anything. We just wanted to get help into the country, and they wouldn't allow it. I myself traveled outside of Bolivia and then came back. And on my way back, I talked to some firemen. I was in New York, and asked that they could donate to me old equipment because my friends, people in the movement, were on the fires area and literally their shoes were melting. So I was trying to bring anything that we could bring to help them, including masks to protect ourselves. And they were taken away from me when I got to the airport. They even took away my passport. I was intimidated for about 3 hours. I'm pretty sure had we not made some noise in the local press, they would have kept me there. And anyone that tried to bring in any donations was not allowed to. And then we even managed to contact some firemen from other countries that were volunteering to come in. And the government, one, never allowed them in, the Cancilleria, so the foreign ministry. And two, they started attacking us for asking for help. So once they start attacking us, that's when we realized either we make this clear so people know what's happening if something happens to us, or we don't know what's going to happen. And the fact that they reacted like that was so illogical. What we think was that if they were to declare a national emergency, which is what we were asking, because unless you declare a national emergency, it's not legal to bring in donations. If they did that, then the elections had to be suspended, and they also had to take all the budget that was currently being spent on electoral campaign, and they would have had to use it on the areas that were affected, because we have declared a national emergency. And I think on the other side, the Morales government had been so effective at creating this image where they really cared about the environment, especially with their whatever they said in the UN and other international arenas, that admitting that we had such a huge crisis because of legislation that they themselves had passed was kind of admitting that they had been lying to everyone all along. But the sad part is that despite everything that's happened ever since, because it's been over a year, we have a transitional government that is in power. The transitional government is composed by a lot of politicians that were opposed to the Morales government, but they also have not annulled the legislation that makes this possible. So today, as we sit in the middle of a pandemic, the laws that say that it's legal to use fire in forest areas to clear up land are still in place. And that is what our movement is currently protesting.
So Evo Morales, because of corruption, was moved out of power, but I believe, right? But in, meanwhile, the elites haven't changed, the laws haven't changed. The popular movement that exists in Bolivia, the national meetings that took place in October, various other organizing. What do you think is the potential and the real prospect of their being powerful enough to affect real social change in Bolivia?
I think one thing I really value from what's happened in the past year is that civil society is a lot more brave now to condemn any authority. There was a lot of fear during the Morales government, I have to admit, because when people saw anyone that dared to speak against them being heavily persecuted and leaving the country, a lot of people were just afraid to speak up. But now, even though we have a transitional government and all the institutions are weak, I'm very happy that a lot of civil society is questioning this government as much as they question the Morales government, and if not even more, which I find is amazing. A lot of people have said that it was disloyal to do this because we are going through a transition, but we really think that during a transitional government is when you have to be most critical of any government, because otherwise it will be able to establish a very authoritarian line again. And I also think another thing that's very important to realize is that Bolivia is essentially a country that is ruled by social movements. And in that sense, I would also like to make it very clear that Standing Rivers is one of many citizens organizations. We are not pretending to speak for all Bolivians. But we are a young movement. We focus on nonviolence. We're trying to learn. When we began, you mentioned that it was interesting to see if Gandhian ideas and ideas of nonviolence could work in Bolivia. But if you look at the history of indigenous protests in Bolivia, most of them have been peaceful. Even the great marches of the 1990s, the ones that began defending territory and dignity, La Marcha por la Dignidad y Territorio, they were peaceful protests. And in a lot of our indigenous culture, not all of it, but most of it, especially on the lower lands, there is already an idea of peace that's installed, maybe not with that word, because indigenous people coexist with the environment. It's not an aggressive form of existence. It's instead one that is always looking for balance, and that applies to both highlands and lowlands. So I think that is a beautiful thing that our movement is being able to learn right now as a youth movement. And that I would really like to point out, Bolivia has already many examples in its history of nonviolence being effective. I'd like to call the example of the 1979 hunger strike, led by women that were the wives of mining leaders, that also sparked a whole national revolution, to call it that way. And I think Bolivia is a country that has so much to offer that I do not lose hope on our people. And I do not lose hope, especially on our generation, because I think that we, because of everything we've lived through and everything we've seen, unlike older generations, we understand the importance of inclusion, the importance that indigenous people, the importance that the LGBT community, the importance that many minorities that have been ignored by previous elites, they have to be part of the Bolivia we're dreaming. Otherwise, we're going to keep bumping with the same mistakes. It was Morales now, it was other presidents in the past. But if we don't learn that we have to have a plural vision of what our country is, our country will never get to be everything that it could be.
Well, a lot of people, at least here in the US, may think of Standing Rock when they hear about Standing River and the efforts and involvement of the indigenous community as one of the leaders of these struggles. And so after our station break, which we're going to do in just a minute, we're going to talk a bit about movement building on a global level, which you're able to do at Freedom Fellows at Human Rights Foundation, drawing off on your knowledge in the struggles in Bolivia. So, you know, this gives us hope that younger people can learn from each other, that anyone can learn from each other and try to build a new way of organizing change. Even in the US, we see something like this happening, though the success is uncertain. So please stay tuned, everyone. This is Justice for All, and the show is UN This Week. So welcome back. This is UN This Week, and we are speaking with Janiece Vakadasa about nonviolent social change and organizing. And I wanted to invite to join our conversation Fred Larson, who is one of our summer interns. And Janiece, I understand that you studied in a program at Harvard. Fred is on his way to Harvard in the fall, though an online Harvard, or will they actually let you in the door?
It will be online, at least for the fall.
Okay. Maybe not quite the same, but the Kennedy School is at Harvard, right?
My program was done online though, so I've never even been to the campus, to be honest. Even
Wow.
more, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, you're fellow, you're affiliated, and so what was that study, and how has that study kind of helped to prepare you for your current role with the Freedom Fellows?
That study was done in the fall of 2018, and I am very thankful that I got to do it live. I mean, online, because at the time I was here in Bolivia, we were just starting Standing Rivers, and it was a good thing to have a reason to read about nonviolence 24/7, because it was a lot of reading, which I'm very thankful for, and learn from many different cases of nonviolence across the world. Because in a way, I was kind of reading that, and then at the same time, in the afternoons, we were going out to protest something. So it was a very hands-on approach to nonviolence. And it was very important because it helped me realize that there are very few opportunities for people that want to learn about nonviolence, organizing, and protesting when it comes to higher education. And I'm even sad to say that that program no longer exists at Harvard. If you want to learn about nonviolence, usually, especially as a person like me that lives in a country in South America or in Africa, you would usually have to study conflict resolution. If you want to do some sort of higher studies on that, you would have to move to Europe or the US for a year or two to study. And in the meantime, you completely lose touch with reality on the ground in your own country. So that need to be able to study, but also not being separated from your people and your movement and your cause, is one of the things that for me make the Freedom Fellowship and the Human Rights Foundation such an important opportunity.
Fred, did you want to ask some questions?
Yes. So, with your organization and otherwise in Bolivia, do you think Bolivian citizen activists can provide a model for liberation in post-colonial states worldwide?
Model is a strong word. I don't think you can copy paste anything in activism.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the time, each country, each community itself, like every city is so different in Bolivia, that everyone has to figure it out. What I do hope is that it brings some sort of hope of how nonviolence can work even in societies that are extremely plural and complicated. Um, as an example, that the basic ideas can be successful, but not necessarily the strategy. I think the strategy for each cause is very unique to its own culture and its own language, its own reality.
Yeah, I was just noticing that there are a lot of positive comments. Janiece, a role model, says Luis Martin. Chai Tree says heartiest congratulations. Joselo, I don't know how to pronounce. I'm so glad to hear this wonderful lady explain how hard it was in my country to deal with that problem without any help from the Morales government. Emilio Ludwig, amazing work of Janiece and Standing Rivers. They impulse, they create great ideas, wonderful actions, and new peaceful revolution in Bolivia. You have a fan club out there. So as far as though spreading, sharing good ideas, you mentioned the Freedom Fellows, and maybe we could go on to the website and take a look and scroll down. And maybe if you could tell us a little bit about some of these Freedom Fellows.
Just wonderful people. So essentially, the idea for the Freedom Fellowship is to support activists that work in authoritarian regimes, because usually there's a lot of people in Europe and the US and other countries that have many, many opportunities for fellowships and scholarships, but people in our countries, especially the ones that are brave enough to stand up against the system, are usually kind of put in a dark box by the government and unable to get any of these wonderful opportunities. So we wanted to provide support. One way I love to explain it is find the little Martin Luther Kings of the world and give them the support that they need in order to enact good, peaceful change. But at the same time, understand that what we can provide is the support, but the ideas and the leadership have to come from the people themselves. So one thing I've seen as a Bolivian is that many NGOs come here and they provide help, and it's very useful help and very needed help, but they sort of tame the revolutionary spirit in many activists, because you get used to receiving aid instead of continue to change the system that made you in the position where you need aid in the first place. So the idea with the Freedom Fellowship is that these wonderful activists have these mentors that are able to support them in many areas, such as nonviolent movement building, personal leadership, mental health, fundraising, digital security. But at the end of the day, the stars of the show, it's them. And they have to realize that no one can fix things for them, which I think they already know.
Did you want to name any of the particular current fellows?
Of course, I think the new fellows class is going to be announced soon in a couple of weeks. But if we look at the 2019-2020 class, for example, you can see in your screens, Asma Khalifa is a Libyan activist that I really admire. I think Libya, as much as Bolivia, is a country that is very complicated, that you cannot summarize in a good versus bad storyline. And Asma has been a very strong voice for women from Libya, and also working on nonviolence. And I think if you work for nonviolence in Libya, that shows there's no country where you cannot at least try. Edip Siaduon is a Nicaraguan pro-democracy activist that I really admire. Working on human rights and standing up to abusive governments is very difficult for anyone, but I dare to say that it's even more difficult for women, because there are many more things that regimes tend to attack when you're a woman. And Edipsia and her example of strength and courage is one thing that has lightened all of us. If you go down a little bit more, we can see Fred Bauma. He's called the Gandhi of Congo. He's from DRC, and he leads a movement that's called Lucha, that has been using nonviolence activism to enact change, and they've done a lot of it on a local level in a pretty successful way in DRC, which is one of the most violent countries in Africa. So I think I invite people to look at our website, to look at the stories of these brave activists and learn how, if there's such brave people that dare to stand up to abuse and authoritarianism and do it peacefully, then I think there's very little excuse to not try to learn from other activists that are also in the struggle.
Mm. Well, it is inspiring, and these are risk takers. Human rights defenders are attacked by governments around the world, which gives us at Justice for All something to respond to. But we don't want them to go to jail. But we also realize that they're taking risks for a larger cause. Fred, did you want to jump in with a question?
Yes, sure. So earlier I thought it was really interesting how you talked about the concept of the banana republic, or like outside exploitation of a country by the US or other states. And I was just wondering, so in the US, we often, throughout history, we have glorified the concept of free trade while ignoring the victims of it. And I'm just wondering, what extent are other American actions glorified, or their harmful actions hidden to the public?
I think there's many of them. And I think that it's very important to understand, and I've learned this through activism, that people are different from their governments. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we always try to make clear as activists is that you cannot hate people or a whole country because of what their government has done, because on many occasions, and that's happened in Bolivia and many other countries, the governments are making decisions, especially when it comes to foreign affairs, without even consulting with the people. Mm-hmm. And I think one great way to kind of step away from that is education itself. And I think a lot of American citizens are not very well educated on the actions that their country has taken in other countries. I think pop culture and cinema and many other things kind of glorify the role in the US in international intervention and make it like they're always kind of trying to fix things, when in reality there are so many interests that play into that. But I also think that the best way to love your country, and we do that here in Standing Rivers, is to be honest and to be truthful to the people in power. And that's one thing that Martin Luther King said. I also think that as much damage as the US has done, they have wonderful stories of activism, such as the Civil Rights Movement or the HIV movement in the 80s. ACT UP, I really admire them. And speak truth to power. I think as frustrating as history can be, the people that can change things is us. And I think sometimes change doesn't need to be done on a huge level. Sometimes you can change things on a local level, but your example is already setting a higher standard for people that are working with you on many things. So currently, there is much to say about your current government. But I think if there are any Americans watching this, I would say we stopped our country for 21 days because there was a fraud in our elections. You have the chance to go and vote, so please do it.
Mm.
Thank you.
That would be a perfect note to go out on. But I did want to ask about international organizations and their role. Self-reliance of communities is very important. It's key. But on the other hand, this show is UN this week, and we think about the role of the UN and its agencies, and also regional organizations like OAS, which is Organization of American States. And so, what role do you see, and what relationship do you see local groups having with these international groups?
See, that's the thing, and that is the reason why I study nonviolence and why I'm so thankful that I have the opportunity to work at the Human Rights Foundation in the Freedom Fellowship program. Because most of the time, if you're an activist that is being oppressed and is suffering abuse by your government, you would have to have an attorney, you would have to have a translator, you would have to have a budget for trips, you would have to have many things that normal activists do not have in their power in order to bring your case to international institutions such as the UN or the OAS in the say that their Commission for Inter-American Human Rights. And I think that most of the time, normal people, normal citizens don't have this ability and don't have the power to do so. So initially, when I studied international relations and I volunteered at UNICEF in my university, my dream was to work for an international organization that defended human rights because I thought this is a place where maybe you can make justice for people that are oppressed. But as time went on, I realized that international organizations can support local groups, but it is the local groups the ones that make change. And the change is often done through nonviolence and through huge mass movements and through social organization. Which is I completely shifted the goals of my career. And the Human Rights Foundation, the Freedom Fellowship is one of our programs. We also have the Oslo Freedom Forum. We have Defending the Defenders, which focus on environmental activists. We have the Hong Kong desk that focuses on Hong Kong, for example. And I really love that a lot of the people that work on these programs are people that have a lot of knowledge about those countries and that sometimes are even from those countries. And again, one thing that we always said in Bolivia was that the international community could be important allies, but at the end of the day, no one is going to protect your community better than you do it yourself. And I think that the Human Rights Foundation understands that very well. That is why we support and we engage with activists that are doing change in their communities.
You've inspired a lot of comments. Didn't mean to cut you off, but Sandra is saying, Janiece, I wish you were here in the USA to help us today as our country is trying to enlist changes for Black Lives Matter and many causes. So we can learn from each other. And yes, that is something that we get also from this Zoom technology and online connections. So we're going to have to wind it up, but this is very inspiring. I know that many people have said so on the comments. And I hope that people will visit your website. We also wanted to let people know about an upcoming event, but do you have any events coming up yourself?
We have the elections coming up on October the 18th if we don't have to postpone them again due to COVID. And I would really like to ask people watching this that you keep an eye on Bolivia. I know that there are many things happening in many countries, but we are on a very decisive time in our history. I think if we fail right now to defend democracy, Bolivia could go through a very dark moment. So we need the eyes of the international community on us, especially activists like myself who are working for things that go even against local interests, such as the environment and our forests and our human rights. So Please keep your eyes on that, on us, and in Bolivians themselves. A lot of people seem to be Bolivian experts today, and a lot of people that have never even been to Bolivia have huge opinions on what's happening. But listen to the people, listen to Bolivian citizens. I know we're not easy to find, we're not everywhere, but let us speak for our own reality. So thank you.
Oh, bless you, bless you. And from Bolivia to Burma, just wanted to put up an announcement that we at Justice for All organizing August 9th, a public conference. You can check it out on the website and join us for an all-day conference. Some of the same things happening in Bolivia are happening in Burma. Unfortunately, these are global trends as much as they're local challenges. So thank you again, Janiece. Thanks, Fred. And stay tuned, everybody.
Thank you.